The black velvet mask was waiting on my kitchen table when I got home. I stopped in the doorway with my keys still cold in my palm, staring at it beside a cream envelope sealed in dark red wax, as if my tiny apartment had been entered by someone who knew exactly how little it would take to disturb the air inside it. The radiator hissed. Somewhere in the hall, a neighbor's TV laughed too loudly. I set my grocery bag down without taking off my coat and saw my name written across the envelope in elegant black ink. Lucia Moretti, no return address, no note from the doorman, nothing except the weight of intention. Inside was a single card, thick as pressed linen, edged in gold leaf. Tonight, midnight, Palazzo Belladonna. Carnival attire required. Transportation provided. Beneath that, one sentence in smaller script. If you want a life no one can take from you, come alone. I read it twice, then a third time, hearing my own pulse in the silence that followed. At 26, working in the lower glass floors of DeLuca Holdings where assistants were replaced as easily as printer paper, I had learned to distrust anything that arrived dressed like a miracle. But I had also learned what unpaid rent sounded like when your landlord knocked with his wedding ring against the door, what ambition felt like when it had no wealthy last name behind it, what it meant to watch promotions rise past you because you were useful exactly where you were. I checked the locks. No scratches. No forced frame. Whoever had entered had either been let in or never needed permission in the first place. Tucked beneath the invitation was a second object I hadn't seen at first, a car service card with tonight's pickup time, 11:15 p.m., and my address already embossed into the corner. That was the moment the situation changed. Before that, it had been a strange invitation. After that, it became proof that someone had chosen me specifically, arranged for me specifically, and expected an answer tonight. I should have called the building manager. I should have thrown the mask in the trash and pretended none of it had happened. Instead, I crossed the room, picked up the velvet mask, and felt the nap of the fabric brush my fingertips like a warning. It was expensive, hand-finished, lined in silk, not a party store costume, but something selected for a room where money wanted to be seen without introducing itself. I turned it over and found a tiny stitched crest inside, an ornate lion with a crown, a symbol I recognized from the higher executive invitations that sometimes passed through the office mailroom. My mouth went dry. Whoever sent this moved in circles above mine, the kind of circles where careers were made over dinner and ruined before dessert. I stood there a long time with the card in one hand and my phone in the other, thumb hovering over my friend Gianna's contact, then lowering again. Come alone. It was a ridiculous command. It was also the only honest line on the card. If I told someone, the spell would break into common sense, and common sense had never once opened a locked door for me. At 10:40, I opened the one garment bag in my closet I never used, the black dress I had bought on clearance for a future important enough to justify it. The fabric was cool and heavy, the zipper loud in the small room. I pinned my hair up, left two loose strands at my jaw, and held the mask to my face under the bathroom light, watching a stranger take shape in the mirror. Not richer, not safer, just harder to read. At 11:15 sharp, a black car idled beneath my apartment window, its headlights washing pale bands across the cracked ceiling. I could smell the faint powder of my perfume and the city's damp winter stone when I stepped outside. The driver never looked surprised to see me. He just opened the rear door and said, "Miss Moretti." I got in. Leather, cedar, a whisper of cigar smoke in the stitching. The lock clicked softly as we pulled away from the curb, and the streets of Palermo began folding behind me, one block at a time, carrying me toward a night with no name on it, and a man I had not met yet, but who already knew exactly where I lived. Music reached the car before the palace did, a distant throb of violins and drums rolling through the cold Palermo night like something half royal, half forbidden. By the time the wrought iron gates opened, torchlight was flickering over wet stone, and Palazzo Belladonna rose out of the dark with its balconies glowing gold behind sheets of silk and colored glass. Lucia felt the black velvet mask warm against her palm as the driver stepped out first, opened her door, and offered no instructions at all. That silence said more than words could. Inside the courtyard, the air smelled of orange peel, candle wax, and expensive perfume. Feathers brushed past bare shoulders. Satin whispered over marble. Masks turned toward her, then away again, as if everyone in that place had agreed to pretend not to notice who had arrived alone. A server in white gloves appeared with a crystal flute of sparkling water and a single sentence. "The Signora is expected in the winter gallery." He was gone before Lucia could ask by whom. She crossed beneath painted ceilings and chandeliers that trembled softly in the draft, her heels tapping over black and white stone, each step carrying her deeper into a world that had already prepared a path for her. The winter gallery opened in silver light. Glass doors framed a moonlit garden outside, and inside, musicians played beneath a ceiling painted with faded gods and storms. Then a man in a dark mask stepped into her path as if he had been there the whole time, simply waiting for the exact second she would arrive. He was taller than everyone around him by a clear head, dressed in black so precise it seemed cut from shadow, his gloves pale against the stem of the wineglass in his hand. He did not reach for her. He only inclined his head once and said, "You came." The voice was low, controlled, carrying no surprise at all. Lucia kept her own mask in place. "You sent a car to my home without signing your name." Curiosity seemed safer than staying home and wondering. A quiet laugh touched the edge of his mouth, though the rest of him remained unreadable. Safer is an ambitious word for tonight. Around them, the carnival swirled on in flashes of red silk, gold dust, and violin strings, but the space between them held stillness, unnatural and deliberate. He offered his hand then, not as a command, not quite as a request. Lucia looked at the gloved hand for a beat too long, then placed her fingers in it. The leather was cool. His grip was careful. He led her into the dance without asking whether she knew the steps, and somehow she did, or perhaps he made it impossible to fail. They moved through the room as if the crowd had been trained to open for them. A woman in emerald feathers stopped talking when he passed. Two masked men lowered their eyes. Lucia caught it in fragments, tiny fractures in the behavior of strangers, the kind of deference people gave to money, power, or danger. "Do they all know you?" she asked. "Enough to move when I walk," he said. "That doesn't answer the question." "No," he replied, and turned her gently beneath the chandelier light. "It only answers the useful part." The answer should have sent her away. Instead, it sharpened everything. The scent of cedar near his collar, the faint scrape of his ring against her knuckles, the measured way he spoke, as if he was used to rooms listening the first time. He asked about her work without naming the company, about what she wanted without mocking the size of the question. Lucia did not give him much, but she gave him enough to hear himself in her silence. "You don't like being studied," he said. "I don't like being chosen without permission." For the first time, he paused. Not long, only a breath, but it was real. "Fair," he said. Then he guided her through a side archway lined with candles and into a balcony corridor above the garden, where the night air cut clean through the perfume and left only winter stone and sea salt. Below them, lanterns drifted among hedges trimmed into labyrinth shapes. Somewhere in the distance, church bells marked midnight. He removed one glove finger by finger, reached into his coat, and drew out a small gold token stamped with a crest she did not recognize. "If you decide before dawn that this night was a mistake," he said, placing it in her hand, "show this at the south gate, and a car will take you home. No questions. No one will stop you." Lucia closed her fingers around the token. It was warm from his body heat, heavy enough to matter. "And if I stay?" she asked. His gaze held hers through the mask, steady and impossible to fully read. "Then you stop being a guest." Before she could answer, music surged again from the ballroom, louder now, and voices below shifted with a ripple she could not place. He glanced toward the garden, attention sharpening for the first time into something harder than charm. When he looked back, the softness was gone from the edges. "Walk back inside," he said quietly. "Do not remove your mask. Do not let anyone lead you anywhere but the main hall unless I return for you myself." Lucia did not move. "Who are you?" The question landed between them like a blade laid flat on silk. He stepped back into the gold and shadow of the corridor, already becoming part of the spectacle again, and answered without answering at all. "The reason you were invited." Morning came into Palermo on a pale wash of sea light and church bells, thin and metallic, drifting between stone buildings still holding the night's cool breath. By the time Lucia stepped through the revolving glass doors of De Luca Holdings, The scent of polished marble and bitter espresso had replaced the perfume and candle smoke of Palazzo Belladonna, yet something from the Carnival clung to her anyway, as if the black velvet of that mask had left a trace against her skin. The token he had pressed into her hand before dawn sat in the side pocket of her bag, heavier than its size allowed, a secret weight tapping lightly against her hip as she crossed the lobby. The building had changed overnight. Security stood straighter. Men in dark suits spoke into earpieces near the elevators. Even the reception desk, usually noisy with keyboards and ringing phones, had gone unnaturally still, as if the air itself had been warned to behave. Lucia slowed when she saw a line of department heads waiting outside the executive floor, their smiles tightened into corporate masks of another kind. "He's here," someone whispered near the brass directory, and that single sentence moved through the lobby faster than the elevator indicators. She had heard rumors for weeks that the company's old leadership would be replaced, that a new name was coming in with money, discipline, and a reputation for turning weak divisions profitable in less than a quarter. Rumors had no face. They did not usually arrive with a convoy. The elevator doors opened with a soft hydraulic sigh. First came two men she did not recognize, broad-shouldered, silent, scanning before they stepped. Then a legal advisor from the upper floors hurried out with a leather portfolio hugged to his chest. And then the last figure emerged, unhurried, as if the whole building had merely been pausing until he entered it. Alessandro De Luca wore a charcoal suit so sharply cut it seemed to hold its own edge in the light. No mask, no costume, no gold and candle shadow to soften him. But the same stillness moved with him, that same unbearable control she had felt on the balcony when his voice lowered and every instinct told her to listen. Lucia did not recognize him by one thing alone. It was the total pattern, the measured pace, the watchfulness in his eyes before he looked at anyone directly, the small pause before he answered a greeting, as if deciding how much of himself to allow into the room. And when his gaze found her across the lobby, the world did not stop dramatically. It narrowed. The bells outside faded. A printer somewhere on the mezzanine clicked through a page. Her fingers tightened around the strap of her bag until the leather creaked. He knew exactly who she was. There was no surprise in his face, only a calm acknowledgement too intimate for strangers and too controlled for anything else. One of the directors rushed forward to welcome him, speaking too quickly, filling the silence with titles and numbers and rehearsed deference. Alessandro shook his hand without looking away from Lucia for more than a second. Then, with the faintest turn of his head, he broke eye contact and the room exhaled. The executive procession moved toward the conference wing, but not before his assistant, a woman in a cream suit with a tablet in hand, changed course and came directly to Lucia. "Ms. Moretti," she said softly, precise enough that nearby employees could hear the respect in it. "Mr. De Luca would like you in the 10th floor boardroom." Now, heat climbed under Lucia's collar despite the air conditioning. "Me?" The assistant's expression did not shift. Immediately, heads lifted from desks. Conversations flattened. It was too public to refuse without making a scene, and too deliberate to mistake for accident. Lucia followed the assistant across the lobby, every heel strike on stone sounding louder than it should have. Inside the private elevator, the mirrored walls gave her back a face that looked composed from a distance and dangerously alert up close. She could still hear him from the balcony. "Do not trust anyone but me." At the time it had sounded theatrical, almost impossible. In daylight, inside her own office building, it became something worse. Plausible. The boardroom was all smoked glass, cold chrome, and a table long enough to suggest decisions were made there that reached far beyond payroll and quarterly reports. Senior managers stood along one side, while screens glowed with merger projections and regional maps. At the head of the table, Alessandro signed a document, capped the pen, and finally looked up at her. "Close the door," he said. No one else moved. Lucia did it herself. The latch clicked, a small sound that seemed to separate the room from the rest of the city. "Ms. Moretti works in compliance support," one executive said, confused enough to forget caution. "Why is she?" Alessandro lifted one hand, and the man stopped mid-sentence. "Because I asked for her." The silence that followed was not office silence. It was obedience. Lucia felt it pass through the room like a pressure change before a storm. Alessandro stepped away from the head of the table and came nearer, not close enough to touch, only close enough for memory to do the rest. His cologne was clean and restrained, cedar and something darker beneath it. And for one brief second the palace balcony returned in full detail, velvet curtains moving in the night air, distant strings, the warning in his voice. "You left before dawn," he said, low enough that the others had to pretend not to listen. It was not a question. Lucia held his gaze. "You told me to." A flicker passed through his eyes, almost approval, almost caution. Around them, executives stared at spreadsheets they were no longer reading. Alessandro turned to the room. "From today forward, Ms. Moretti will report directly to my office on special assignments." Shock did not arrive loudly. It showed itself in rigid shoulders, in a dropped pen, in the assistant's fingers freezing above her tablet. Lucia felt the floor shift beneath her without moving an inch. This was not recognition. It was selection, in public, with no explanation. He looked back at her, all daylight now, all authority stripped of disguise. "My office," he said, as if delivering a simple instruction. "In 10 minutes. And with that, the man from the Carnival stepped fully into the shape of her new life, no longer hidden behind velvet and shadow, but seated at the center of her world with the power to summon her by name. Leather gave a soft sigh as the office door closed, and the hush that followed felt thicker than the air outside, chilled by hidden vents and carrying the faint scent of bergamot and polished wood. Sunlight cut through the floor-to-ceiling glass in clean white bars, catching on steel, crystal, and the dark mirror of the conference table where a single folder had already been placed at one end, waiting. Lucia stepped in with her pulse still uneven from the public summons, and Alessandro did not rise to greet her. He sat behind a desk too large for anyone who needed to prove power, jacket immaculate, cufflinks glinting once when he lifted a pen and signed the last page before sliding it aside. "Close the second door," he said. There was another panel hidden in the wall, nearly invisible until she touched it. When it sealed, the sounds of keyboards and ringing phones from the executive floor vanished completely. He studied her for a moment, not with the distracted glance of a new scanning a personnel file, but with the same unbearable precision he had used beneath the Carnival mask, as if he had chosen each second in advance. Then he pushed the folder toward her. Inside were 3 pages, a schedule, and a temporary access card embossed with a level no one in her position should have had. "From today on, you report directly to me on special assignments," he said. "Internal briefings, private correspondence, meetings that won't appear on the official calendar." Lucia looked up too quickly. "Why me?" The question came out sharper than she intended. A faint line formed beside his mouth, not quite a smile. "Because you notice what others miss," he said. "And because you know how to keep your balance in a room built to make people forget themselves." The words should have sounded like praise. Instead, they landed with the weight of a lock turning. He stood and crossed to the windows, Palermo burning gold beyond the glass, church domes and traffic, and sea haze spread below them, beautiful and far away. "There will be privileges," he said, facing the city. "A car when I require you after hours. Restricted access. Discretion from everyone around you." He turned then, and the light sharpened the planes of his face, stripping away any softness the morning might have given him. "And there will be a boundary." Lucia kept one hand on the folder, fingertips pressed into the paper hard enough to bend it. "What kind of boundary?" "You will do the work I place in front of you," he said. "You will not ask about where I go, who I meet outside this building, or why certain decisions are made. Curiosity is expensive here." The room seemed to cool another degree. Somewhere behind the glass, a helicopter passed low over the city, its thudding blades muffled into a distant pulse. Lucia should have stepped back. Instead, she opened the folder again and saw that the first assignment was already marked for that afternoon. Accompany him to a closed strategy session in the old boardroom and record only what he instructed. No distribution, no archive, no assistance. "This isn't normal," she said quietly. "No," Alessandro answered. "It isn't." He moved back to the desk and set a small silver key beside the access card. "That opens the file cabinet inside the communications suite adjacent to my office. You will work there now." It was not a request. Before Lucia could answer, a knock sounded at the outer door, quick and uncertain. His expression changed at once, becoming colder by subtraction rather than force. "Come." A senior division head entered carrying 2 binders, then stopped short when he saw Lucia still standing there. Surprise flickered across the man's face, followed by something closer to offense. "Sir, I was told this material was for executive eyes only." Alessandro did not even look at him. "Then you were told correctly." The binders were taken from the man's hands and placed beside Lucia's folder. "Miss Moretti will handle the summary." The division head hesitated just long enough to reveal the insult before he swallowed it. Of course, when he left, the silence he carried out with him felt different. Not empty now, rearranged. Lucia understood the change before she accepted it. In less than 10 minutes, Alessandro had pulled her out of the invisible ranks and placed her where others could see her standing too close to his power. That kind of proximity did not protect a person. It marked one. "You're making enemies for me," she said. This time his gaze held hers without disguise, dark and unreadable and far too calm. "No," he said. "I'm showing them they don't get to touch what is under my authority." The words should have reassured her, but they only sharpened the danger hidden inside them. He reached for a document, signed once more, then slid it across the desk. It was a confidentiality agreement, narrower than a company contract and stricter in every line. At the bottom, beside the place for her signature, his own name had already been written in black ink. "If you walk out now," he said, "you return to your old desk, and this conversation ends. If you sign, your work changes today, and so do the rules around you." Lucia read the page while the air hummed softly above them, and sunlight crept another inch across the floor. Her name looked small in the blank line waiting for it. The memory of his hand at her waist under lantern light, the warning on the balcony, the public summons that morning, the access card, the key, the watchful hostility in that division head's eyes. None of it fit inside any ordinary explanation. Yet turning back would not return things to where they had been. Not after he had called her forward in front of the whole company. She picked up the pen. Alessandro watched without moving, the way a man might watch a match lowered toward dry silk. When she signed, he took the paper, folded it once, and locked it in the top drawer of his desk. Then he leaned back and gave her the first true instruction that sounded less like a corporate order than a warning wrapped in courtesy. "Be in the old boardroom at 6, he said. "And Lucia, if anyone asks why you're there, tell them I asked for loyalty, not questions." Warm air from the old boardroom vents carried the faint smell of dust, printer toner, and strong espresso gone cold hours ago. Frosted sconces washed the walnut walls in a low amber glow, while the last of Palermo's daylight bled silver through tall windows, and by 6 o'clock the room felt less like a workplace than a chamber built for decisions people preferred not to describe. Lucia stepped inside with the folder Alessandro's assistant had left on her desk, expecting numbers, contracts, perhaps another loyalty test dressed in polished language. Instead, she found only one laptop already open at the far end of the table, its screen filled with wire transfers moving through shell companies she had never seen on any official DeLuca Holdings chart. No one else was there. The leather chair across from the computer was still warm when she touched it, and that small leftover heat made her look toward the door just as a voice from the hallway said, "Leave it with her." Footsteps faded. The latch clicked. She was alone. For a second, she stood very still, hearing only the hum of the air system and the thin rattle of rain beginning against the glass. Then she set the folder down, moved to the screen, and did the one thing Alessandro had warned her never to do. A payment marked as consulting fees had been divided into 6 smaller transfers, routed through a port company in Catania, then through a charity in Trapani, and finally into accounts connected to private security firms that did not exist on paper. Her fingers hovered over the trackpad. Another tab held names. Some belonged to councilmen. Some belonged to transport unions. One belonged to a judge whose face she recognized from local television. And threaded between them, repeated with discreet precision, was a set of initials attached to authorizations only a person at the top could approve. ADL Lucia swallowed and opened the physical folder she had brought only to find it was not a report at all, but a stack of invoices with tiny inconsistencies, rounding errors, duplicate stamps, signatures copied too cleanly. It looked careless until she understood the opposite. This was not one mistake. It was architecture. She pulled a legal pad toward her and began writing down company names, dates, amounts under $10,000, all the small numbers designed to slip through clean hands without leaving dirt behind. The old clock above the sideboard clicked louder with every line she wrote. Then the screen dimmed. A message box appeared. Stop digging. Her pulse kicked once, hard enough to make the pen mark slash across the page. She spun toward the door, but it remained closed. The rain came faster now, tapping the windows like impatient fingers. Lucia crossed the room, opened the door, and found the corridor empty except for a janitor's cart parked under a painting of Mount Pellegrino. When she looked back, the message was gone. In its place sat a security access window requesting a code. She should have left. She knew that with the same cold certainty that tells a person not to touch a live wire. Instead, she checked the folder again and found a sticky note clinging to the inside flap, almost hidden in the seam. Archive B19. No signature. No explanation. The elevator ride to the sublevel felt longer than it was. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. The concrete hallway below smelled of bleach, damp paper, and sea salt blown in from somewhere beyond the loading docks. Archive B19 turned out to be a records room behind a keypad door that had been left improperly latched, just enough for someone careful to notice. Inside, metal shelves rose in gray rows, packed with bankers' boxes labeled with years, subsidiaries, and obsolete project names. Lucia found B19 near the back beside a dehumidifier whining into the chill. The box held no accounting ledgers. It held photographs, envelopes, a ledger written by hand, men standing beside trucks at midnight, cash counted on restaurant tables, a shipping manifest with cargo changed twice in different ink. And on the first page of the handwritten book, beneath a date from 3 years earlier, one line was pressed so hard into the paper it had nearly cut through. Protection renewed under DeLuca authority. Sicily knew how to whisper certain names. She had heard them since childhood in market stalls, in cabs, in the hush that falls after old men lower their voices. Now those same names appeared in black ink beside port routes, judges, union leaders, and payments that flowed back, always back, toward the same center. Alessandro was no longer just a man with too much control and too many locked doors. He was the point where the lines met. A floorboard creaked behind her. Lucia turned so fast the ledger slipped from her hands and struck the concrete with a flat crack. A security guard stood in the doorway, not one of the lobby men in clean navy suits, but an older one with rain darkening his shoulders and a radio clenched in his fist. His gaze dropped to the open box, then to the page on the floor, and whatever he read there drained the color from his face. He reached for the radio. Lucia moved first, snatching the ledger and stepping back before he could block her. "Don't call anyone," she said, but the plea came out thinner than she wanted. The guard hesitated only a heartbeat before lifting the radio anyway. Then his expression changed. Not softer. Worse. He lowered it slowly and said, with the stiff caution of a man who had just realized the danger had shifted shape, "Miss Moretti, you shouldn't be here." Somewhere above them, an elevator motor groaned to life. The elevator cables shuddered somewhere above the sublevel, and the sound traveled through the concrete like a warning too heavy to ignore. Cold fluorescent light flattened the dust in Archive B19, turning the rows of steel shelves into narrow gray corridors, while the paper in Lucia's hands felt dry and sharp enough to cut skin. The guard kept his body in the doorway, one hand still resting on the radio at his shoulder, but he was no longer looking at her like an employee caught where she did not belong. He was looking past her, at the ledger. "Give it to me," he said quietly. "Now." Lucia's fingers tightened around the book. "If I hand this over, what happens to me?" The guard swallowed. A bead of sweat slid from his temple despite the chill below ground. "That depends on who reaches you first." The elevator motor stopped. For one suspended second, the entire floor seemed to hold its breath. Then came the clean metallic ring of the doors opening. Lucia did not wait to see who stepped out. She moved fast, not toward the guard but sideways between shelves, the ledger clutched to her chest, her flats slipping on the polished concrete before catching again. Behind her, the guard cursed under his breath and pushed off the doorway. The radio crackled once, then died in a burst of static. She ran deeper into the archive, where the air smelled of glue, old cardboard, and machine oil, where labels in black block letters blurred past her eyes. B17, B21, B23. Somewhere behind her, footsteps entered the room, measured and unhurried. more frightening than pursuit. Not the guard's clumsy rush. Someone else. Lucia reached a dead-end wall of boxed tax records and spun around, breathing through her mouth, the ledger pressed flat against her ribs. The guard appeared first from the left aisle, chest rising hard, his hand lifted as if he wanted to calm a frightened animal. But he never reached her. A second figure stepped into the crossing aisle between them, all dark wool, black gloves, and a stillness that seemed to absorb the fluorescent hum. Alessandro said nothing at first. He only looked at the ledger in Lucia's arms, then at the guard. The older man dropped his gaze immediately. "Leave us," Alessandro said. No raised voice, no visible anger. Yet the words landed with the finality of a locked gate. The guard hesitated a fraction of a second, then backed away, the soles of his shoes whispering against the floor until he vanished behind the shelving. Lucia stayed where she was. "You told me not to pry," she said, and her voice came out rough from the run. "You also arranged for me to be chosen, didn't you? The invitation, the car, all of it." Alessandro took one step closer, the faint scent of cedar and rain still clinging to his coat, absurdly familiar down here among dust and records. "Yes." The single word hit harder than denial would have. "Why?" she asked. "Because now they know you found something," he said. "And because if you walk out of this building alone, someone will take you before sunset." Lucia stared at him, waiting for the edge of a threat, but it never came. What came instead was worse, certainty. "Who?" Alessandro's jaw tightened. He glanced toward the dark mouth of the aisle where the guard had disappeared, then back at her. "Men who won't care whether you understand what's in that ledger. Only that you touched it." As if summoned by his words, a sharp pop cracked from somewhere above them, followed by the distant scream of tires in the street outside, and another burst of frantic static over the abandoned radio. Alessandro's eyes lifted briefly toward the ceiling. "It starts faster than I expected." Lucia's pulse stumbled. "What starts?" "The moment you stop being an employee," he said, "and become leverage." He held out his hand, not for the ledger this time, but for her. "Come with me, and I can keep you alive. Refuse, and every door in Palermo becomes a place they can reach you." She did not move. "You're asking me to trust the man at the center of this." "No," he said, his expression turning colder, stripped of every polished layer he wore upstairs. "I'm telling you that your life changed the minute you opened that book." Another sound rolled down from above, heavier this time. Not machinery, but impact, followed by the muffled bark of voices. Alessandro stepped in, took off his coat, and draped it over the ledger to hide its shape. Then he caught her wrist, firm but not cruel, and turned her toward a narrow service door half concealed behind shelving. It had no handle on the outside, only a key panel worn smooth by years of use. "There's a tunnel to the loading garage," he said. "My enemies already know your name. In the next 5 minutes, you decide whether you face them with me or without me." He keyed the panel, and as the hidden door clicked open to a strip of darkness and cold air, Lucia understood with a sinking clarity that leaving was no longer the same as escape. Cold air leaked through the hidden seam of the service door, carrying the smell of wet concrete, motor oil, and old stone from somewhere deeper below the building. Beyond the shelves, a radio crackled once in the corridor, then went dead, and the silence that followed felt thinner than paper. Lucia stood between the archive's dust and that strip of darkness, her pulse still loud from the guard's footsteps, while Alessandro kept one hand near the keypad and watched her with the stillness of a man who had already chosen his side long ago. "No more half-truths," she said, her voice low but steady. "If you want me to walk through that door, you tell me who you are." A faint fluorescent hum trembled overhead. For a second he did not move. Then he reached up, loosened his tie with 2 fingers, and drew a slow breath as if the air itself had weight. "My name is Alessandro De Luca," he said, "and that is the least dangerous thing about me." He stepped through the narrow doorway first, not dragging her, not pleading, only expecting her to decide. Lucia followed into a service passage lined with sweating pipes and bare bulbs caged in rusted wire, the chill biting through her blouse. At the end of the tunnel, a steel door opened into an underground loading bay where 2 black SUVs waited under sodium lights, their engines idling with a low mechanical growl. Men in dark coats straightened at the sight of him. No one greeted him by title. They lowered their eyes. One of them, broad-shouldered and gray at the temples, handed him a phone without a word. Alessandro listened for 3 seconds, and something in his face turned harder than the concrete pillars around them. "Lock down the port roads," he said. "Pull our people from Trapani and move them east. Tonight." He ended the call and gave the phone back. Lucia caught the pronoun before she could stop herself. "Our people. Not security. Not staff. A network. A machine." He turned to her then, and the yellow light carved clean lines across the familiar mouth from the Carnival, the same mouth that had once told her to trust no one but him. "You found records tied to shell companies, judges, shipping routes, and protection payments," he said. "They belong to me." The words did not come fast. He placed each one like a stone. "The company is real. So is the money. So is the blood behind some of it." A forklift beeped somewhere in the far bay, then reversed into darkness. Lucia felt the cold rail of a loading ramp against the back of her hand and held there. "You're saying this like it should make sense," she said. "You brought me close, warned me away, and now you expect me to stand here while you admit you run all of it?" "Not all of it," Alessandro said. "Enough that men across Sicily measure risk by whether I've spoken their name." He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. One of the waiting men glanced up at Lucia for half a heartbeat, then quickly away, and that brief look told her more than any dossier could have. Fear moved around Alessandro before he even moved himself. Lucia stepped back from him, not far, just enough to reclaim a sliver of air. "The Carnival," she said. "That was you. You knew before I did. You chose me before I ever walked into that ballroom." "Yes." No apology softened it. "I arranged the invitation. I arranged the car. I wanted to see whether you would still walk into a room where everyone else wore a mask." The loading bay seemed to narrow. Diesel fumes hung under the lights. "Why me?" she asked. Alessandro looked at her the way he had on the dance floor, except now there was no silk mask, no music to hide behind, only concrete, steel, and men who would obey a flick of his hand. "Because you don't bend quickly," he said. "Because when most people smell power, they kneel or they steal. You ask questions." Lucia let out one sharp breath that almost became a laugh and didn't. "So this was a test?" "No," he said, and for the first time the answer came without calculation. "A risk." Then headlights swept across the far wall as another vehicle entered the garage too fast. Doors opened. A voice echoed from the ramp above, urgent and tight. "They hit the accountant's house. He's gone." Alessandro's gaze shifted past Lucia, already measuring distance, exits, response. The men around the SUVs moved at once, hands to earpieces, coats rustling, engines revving louder. Whatever shielded his confession had given her lasted less than a minute. He looked back at her, and the next truth landed colder than the air in the tunnel. "Now you understand why there is no safe version of this," he said. Then he opened the rear door of the nearest SUV and held it for her like a command dressed as a choice. Leather creaked, engines idled, and diesel drifted through the underground garage in a bitter gray haze. Overhead, fluorescent lights buzzed against poured concrete, turning the black SUVs into slabs of moving shadow. Lucia did not get in right away. Her fingers stayed wrapped around the archive folder so tightly the paper edges had cut pale lines into her skin, and Alessandro, one hand on the open rear door, waited without blinking as if time itself worked for him. Then motion snapped across the far end of the garage. A dark sedan shot down the ramp too fast, tires screaming once before correcting. One of Alessandro's men shouted in Italian. Another raised a hand to his earpiece. Lucia moved before Alessandro could touch her. Instead of stepping into the SUV, she turned, seized the steel edge of the half-open loading gate control box beside her, and slammed her palm against the emergency override. A warning siren coughed alive. The corrugated gate began dropping with a grinding metallic groan, cutting the entrance in half just as the sedan lunged forward. The driver swerved hard, clipped a concrete bollard, and stalled sideways in a burst of hot rubber and smoke. For the first time since he had confessed, Alessandro's gaze sharpened not at a threat, but at her. "Inside. Now," he said, but the command landed differently this time. She had just bought his men seconds they had not had. He caught her wrist, pulled her behind the SUV's armored door as two of his guards moved on the disabled car. No wild gunfire came. No cinematic explosion. Just slammed doors, boots hitting cement, and one frightened man dragged out in a linen jacket gone dark with sweat, blinking under the garage lights like he had expected easier prey. Lucia looked at him before Alessandro did. "He wasn't coming for you," she said, hearing the panic in the man's breathing, seeing his eyes fixed on her, not the boss beside her. Alessandro's jaw shifted once. That was all. "Of course he was not," he said quietly. The captured driver spat blood from a bitten lip and laughed anyway. "They said the girl would run," he rasped. "They said she'd break the moment she saw what you are." The words hung in the oil-scented air. Lucia turned toward Alessandro, not stepping back this time. "Then stop moving me like cargo, and tell me what happens if I don't run." Around them, the garage had gone still except for the gate motor finishing its descent with a heavy iron thud. Alessandro studied her with the same unreadable control he had worn behind the Carnival mask, but something in his posture shifted, a fraction less guarded, a fraction more dangerous because it was honest. He dismissed the guards with a look. They dragged the driver away toward the service corridor, leaving only the hum of lights and the cooling tick of the stalled sedan. "If you walk away alone tonight," he said, "my enemies will not see innocence. They will see leverage that still breathes." Lucia lifted the folder between them. "And if I stay with you? Then you stand beside the reason they are afraid." The answer should have sounded like another prison. Instead, under the cold lights and the smell of metal, it felt like the first time he had spoken to her without a mask of charm or corporate polish. She searched his face for the practiced lie, the elegant manipulation, the smooth cruelty she had every right to expect. What she found was worse and cleaner than that. A man who had already calculated every exit and still left one open for her. "No more half-truths," she said. "No more arranging my life from the shadows and calling it protection. If I get into that car, you tell me where we're going, who wants me, and why you chose me in the first place." The silence after that was thin as wire. Alessandro glanced toward the closed gate, then back at her, weighing not power but cost. Lucia did not lower her eyes. In the tunnel below, a billion-dollar company, with the emergency siren fading and the concrete still holding the echo of her choice, the balance shifted again. Not because he saved her, but because she had named the price of staying. Alessandro reached into his coat, took out his phone, and handed it to her unlocked. On the screen was a live map with 3 blinking vehicles converging on the district, all moving too fast. "We're going to my harbor house," he said, "because by the time those cars reach the street above us, this building will no longer be the safest place for you." Then he added the one truth he had kept even after everything else. "And why I chose you, Lucia, is the part that may make you leave anyway." Salt air reached them before the exit did, sliding into the concrete throat of the loading tunnel and cutting through the smell of oil and hot brakes. Somewhere above, a ferry horn rolled across the harbor, low and mournful, while Alessandro's phone cast a cold blue light over the map in Lucia's hands. She looked at the 3 blinking vehicles, then at him, and did not give the phone back. "You said the truth might make me leave," she said, her voice level despite the tremor still trapped in her fingers. "Then say it before we move." The overhead fluorescence buzzed. Alessandro stood very still beside the SUV, one hand on the open rear door, his dark coat catching the pale light like wet stone. "I chose you before Carnival," he said. "Not because you were easy to manipulate. Because you were the only person in that office who returned money no one would have known you kept." Lucia's eyes narrowed. He continued before she could cut him off. 6 months ago, accounting staged a false transfer to test internal theft. You reported it, quietly, and protected the assistant who would have been blamed. I read the report myself. In my world, everyone reaches for power. You reached for what was right when no one was watching. For a second, the garage seemed to lose its echo. Not romance. Not chance. A decision made in silence long before the mask, the music, the impossible night. Lucia drew a breath through the salt and diesel. "So you investigated me. Chose me. Drove me into a lie with velvet around it." "Yes," he said, with no shield left in the word. Tires shrieked from the ramp entrance. Not close, but close enough. A black sedan shot into view at the upper turn, headlights bouncing off concrete pillars. Alessandro moved fast, but this time Lucia did not wait to be pulled. She slammed the SUV's rear door shut, stepped around the hood, and hit the control box mounted to the wall beside the freight gate. A steel shutter began to descend with a grinding roar, sparks flickering where metal scraped metal. The sedan accelerated, horn blasting once, but the gate dropped the final 3 feet with a crash that shook dust from the ceiling. The impact on the other side came a heartbeat later, hard enough to buckle the lower slats. Alessandro looked at her, not with surprise alone now, but with the recognition of someone watching the balance shift in real time. "Drive," Lucia said, "and no more half-truths." They reached the harbor house under a sky the color of tarnished silver. The villa sat over black water and old stone, lanterns burning along the terrace wall while waves slapped the pilings below. Inside, the air smelled faintly of cedar and sea salt. No servants waited. No music played. Only the muted crackle of a fireplace and the distant chop of rotor blades somewhere over the port. Alessandro locked the door behind them, set his pistol on a side table in plain view, then slid a folder across the long oak dining table. "Read it." Lucia opened it with careful hands. Legal transfer documents. Offshore closures. Property deeds. A resignation from DeLuca Holdings already signed by the acting chairman who had served as his public shield. At the bottom sat one final paper. A full controlling trust placing the company's legitimate operations under an independent board by morning. She looked up slowly. "You're cutting yourself out." "From the parts that can be clean," he said. Firelight moved over his face, softer than the garage had allowed, though nothing in him looked weak. "The men coming for you wanted leverage. They wanted the legal empire, the shipping routes, the fear attached to my name. Tonight they lose all 3. As if summoned by the words, Alessandro's phone vibrated once on the table. He answered, listened, and said only, "Finish it without civilians." Then he ended the call and met Lucia's gaze. No gunshots followed. No cinematic storm. Only the slow settling of a decision made elsewhere, across radios and dark piers and rooms where his enemies had finally understood they no longer had a hostage to bargain with or a throne to seize. Lucia stared at the papers again. "You said I might leave. You still might." His voice had dropped to something rougher, stripped clean of command. "Because now you know I built something feared enough to poison every room I enter. And because if you stay, it cannot be as someone kept in the dark." The fire cracked. Harbor wind pressed softly against the tall windows. Lucia took the pen beside the folder, not to sign for him, not to obey, but to pull the resignation free and set it apart from the rest. Then she closed the folder with both palms and looked at the man who had first arrived to her in candlelight and disguise, and now stood before her with nothing left to hide. "I'm not staying for the mask," she said. "And I'm not staying for the fear." Alessandro said nothing. Even the room seemed to wait. Lucia stepped closer until only the edge of the table remained between them, the cedar smoke and sea air winding around both of them. "I'm staying for the man who finally told me the truth before the world forced it out of him." Something in his face gave way then. Not power, not control, but the last hard line between what he had arranged and what he had earned. He came around the table slowly, as if any sudden movement might break the reality of her choice, and rested his hand over hers. Warm skin, cold ring, steady pressure, no mask, no title, no order. Outside, the harbor lights trembled across the water like gold torn into ribbons by the tide. And in that quiet house above Sicily's dark shore, what began in costume and danger ended in the only form of trust either of them could still believe, the kind that survives after the masks come off.